Welcome, welcome. This is a very impromptu live stream about Ryzen 7000 reviews, specifically mine. The reason I'm doing this is I'm currently in a hotel in San Francisco and it's 6 a.m. I wrote the script on the plane. I still haven't finished writing the script. If you want a proper video afterwards, we'll do it. But here we are with Ryzen 7000. You should all know what this is by now. AMD Zen 4, up to 16 cores, up to 5.7 gigahertz. If you're not already reading the reviews that have just gone live, well, this is kind of mine. So I'm going to take you through AMD slide and some of the microarchitecture stuff relating to this chip. And then I'm going to go through my benchmark numbers and explain them. So I hope you're all here. Audio is all on the left side. Yeah. All right then. Give me a second and I'll change it. This is what you call impromptu. Okay, I should be on both sides now. Everybody doing well? Everybody ready? Should be both sides now. So yeah, if you haven't seen processors, heat spreaders, this is what they look like. You'll see plenty of videos about that by now. But yeah, let's go through a large chunk of the AMD slides first. And yeah, there's going to be a lot of kind of bump. In here, you'll see a lot of these posted online. I'm purposely going to go through some of this like kind of quickly. I have had 4 hours sleep after 16 hours of flights yesterday. So let's go. AMD. So this was all in the presentation we had after the small event in Austin. So let's see, here we go. Zen 4 core performance, purpose-built, faster gaming and creation. We'll be the judge of that. Top line numbers, if you hadn't already seen, 13% IPC uplift according to AMD, up to 5.7 gigahertz maximum frequency, and plus 29% total single core performance. So keep those numbers in the back of your head because we'll be referring to them. And then the top of the line, I should actually have put some of my own pictures in this slideshow, but we've got 16 cores, 32 threads. Under the hood, again, it looks like this. You'll see lots of stuff online about it. Wait a second, the 18 meg L2 and L3 is wrong. 170 watt TDP. Total package power tracking is at 230, though I'll go into why that 230 watt number may not be reached in a lot of scenarios. So I've got data to back that up as well. And this is, again, numbers that AMD is putting out. Generational gaming performance, anywhere up to from 6 to 35%. They do have a habit of showing these numbers at 1080p high these days. And then creator performance, again, in the region of about 30 to 50%. And those numbers are, I can confirm, are pretty accurate. So we'll go into those. Hang on a second. That was just general. This is more of the same. Okay, same graph, and then for some reason we've gone back to the beginning of the slideshow, and I have no idea why. Let's go through all these. Or OBS is having me on. Yes. Okay. I'm going to have to delete some of these slideshow slides as we're doing them. This might be easier. Okay. Bear with me. Sorry about this. So we should be on here. Okay, so this is the content creation demo that they showed. V-Ray going from 18,600 up to 30,000. Again, plus 57%. We've got some V-Ray benchmarks later. And then they're also claiming 47% performance per watt. And then, yeah, okay, a lot of these slides are saying the same thing. Okay, and then we have the spec list. So you should, if you've been following, you should know these by now. Ryzen 9, 16-core 32-thread, 5.7 gigahertz at the top. Then you got the Ryzen 9 7900X, that's 12-core, 5.6 gigahertz at the top. Ryzen 7 7700X, 8-core, 5.4 gigahertz at the top. There's no 7800X, and the common thread thinking, though AMD hasn't confirmed it, is that the 5800X will be reserved for the Vcache edition. And then Ryzen 5 7600X, 6-core, 4.3 gigahertz at the top as well. So we've got 170 watt TDP, that's 230 watts package power tracking, and 105 watt TDP, that's 142 watts package power tracking. So next one. And then this is single thread performance, Geekbench 5.4. We're hitting up to 2,275. I didn't get that high, though my numbers for the Core i9 are also slightly lower, I think. But I'll go into those in a bit. And then, so AMD shipped to everybody 2 CPUs, a motherboard, and memory. I got the Ryzen 9 16-core. I got the Ryzen 5 6-core. They sent me the X670E Tai Chi, which had a BIOS update halfway through my testing, which I kind of expected, and it did actually give a few percent more performance. Some of the early BIOS versions apparently had issues where F-clock was running at half speed. So when you buy a motherboard for this platform, make sure you are updating it to the latest BIOS on day one. It's a few percent performance in a few particular benchmarks, but it's just worth highlighting. So, and then yeah, Ryzen 5 7600X. This is the $300 part that's going to be competing against Intel's sort of $200, $150 parts. So I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have in my benchmark numbers later any numbers from the Intel 6-core parts, but I can speak about the gen-on-gen increases between the 7600X and the 5600X. I've got data for those, which we'll get to in a bit. And then the Ryzen 5 7600X saying 5% faster than gaming than the 12900K. This is a lot to do with the single core, single thread frequency and performance. So most of the CPUs actually do pretty well, pretty much the same in single threaded between the 4 of them, which is going to be, I think it's going to be a feature of AMD CPUs as we go forward anyway, because they're not varying the top frequency that much. 400 megahertz single core peak frequency in 5.3 gigahertz. So you're speaking at less than 10%, 8% difference between the bottom chip to the top end chip in single threaded. So, and then AMD, again, these are AMD slides, just to reiterate, we're going to go through their slides, through some of the microarchitecture differences, and then the benchmarks. Leadership core design, this is pretty standard stuff. Zen 4, 5 nanometer, so it's on TSMC's 5 nanometer process, but it's not a straightforward normal 5 nanometer, it's a 5 nanometer HPC variant, and AMD is doing design technology optimization on top of that. So the idea is that it's more focused towards the high frequency aspect of the spectrum. Usually we say that the mobile phone processors are also on the high performance variant of a process node. I'm under the impression that this is a bit beyond that because we're going above 3.5 gigahertz frequencies. So, and then Zen 4 delivered as promised, and the journey. So I will say that Zen 4 isn't a complete redesign of the core. Zen 4 is essentially Zen 3 with updates. AMD used to have this philosophy, if you go see my interviews with Jim Keller, that they would update the baseline design of the core every 5 years or so. And Jim Keller said, no, you need to do that every other generation, essentially. So AMD's in this sort of TikTok model where 1 year they'll redesign the microarchitecture from the ground up. Then the next generation, they'll update that microarchitecture, get all the low-hanging fruit performance, and we'll see a lot of that with Zen 4. And then Zen 5 is the next redesign. And that just means that they're resetting the baseline. A lot of the design elements might be the same. And we saw that a lot from Zen 2 to Zen 3, because Zen 3 was another baseline redesign. But the idea is that you can build on that baseline and get the low-hanging fruit easier than if you just keep iterating on with multiple generations built on the same microarchitecture. So that's that. And new front-end design, we'll go into that. AVX 512 will also go into some of that. We're in the position now where AMD's the only x86 vendor on the market with AVX 512 in their shipping processors. So it is what it is. Actually, AMD are doing some really interesting stuff on the AVX 512 side because of some of the limitations, and it actually surpasses Intel in a number of key areas. I'm not sure if we'll go into that with this video because I don't have the slides done for that yet. But go look at Alexander Yi. I think he's done a post on the Mersenne Prime forum about some of that AVX 512 changes. So, and then 13% higher IPC. The way they're AMD's calculating 13% IPC here is comparing Zen 3 to Zen 4, 8-core versus 8-core. They haven't said whether it's the they're splitting it 4-core on the CCDs or whether they're actually just using one CCD. However, what they're saying is 4 gigahertz fixed frequency, 8-core, a geo mean of all this data on the graph, and you're seeing CPU Z at one end with 1%, Cinebench is only 9%, but then on the other end you've got something like Dolphin and W Prime getting 39%. AMD is usually pretty good on their IPC numbers, though I would like to have seen more industry standard benchmarks in here like Spec. We've got Spec coming later. Hi to everyone. I'm kind of half not looking at chat because there are a ton of slides to go through. And like I say, I've only had 4 hours sleep. Yay! But so this is how AMD is breaking down the IPC contributions, Zen 3 to Zen 4. We've got the front end, which is essentially, if you look at the CPU core, the front end is the first half, the back end is the second half. The first half deals with prefetching and decoding and getting the operations and data ready, whereas the back end is where the data is actually processed by the instructions. So they're saying they've done a lot of work on the front end. They've got, when we'll go into that later, small update to load store, small update to the branch prediction. You could technically throw that in with the front end as well. Execution engine, that's on the back end, and then a small uplift from the L2 cache because we've got a doubling of L2 cache. Doubling of L2 cache usually means you get the square root of 2 benefit in terms of cache misses, fewer cache misses, so 44% fewer cache misses in the L2. And depending on how often you were hitting the L2, if you weren't hitting the L2 that often, then it's a big speed up. Otherwise it's not. So we'll go into some of that as well. I've got memory latency data to show you. And on the AVX 512 type stuff, obviously they're going to, AMD is focusing on HPC. So they're using ONNX or Onyx runtime. This is a standard AI framework tool. And they're comparing 32-bit floating point against previous generation Ryzen, and then 8-bit integer using variable neural network instructions, the VNNI, which are also on this processor, and they're getting a 2.5x speed up. I'll say that in my AVX 512 workload, I got a 6x speed up, and we'll go into that. We'll go into that because that I think is very important. And then in terms of raw power, so even though these chips are 170 watts, the top end, they're saying gen on gen, you're getting 35% performance increase, which at 105 watts is 37%, but when you go down to 65 watts, it's 74%. So I'm going to touch on it briefly in this video. I probably won't do in my main review, but I've got a planned video where I've already done all the 65 watt TDP data, comparing it to previous generations, and the Ryzen 9 is very effective at 65 watts. That's 65 watts package power tracking, so keep that in mind. It's if I was gonna build a system today, money no object. Based on some of this data, a Ryzen 9 7950X running at 65 watts would be very tempting because you still get all the single core performance and you only get slightly reduced multi-threaded performance. So, yeah. So going back to the process technology, 5nm again TSMC. They've been fourth generation TSMC FinFETs. They're using a HPC variant with design technology for optimization. That means enhanced metal stack. Transistors optimized for high performance. They've got multiple products in development, so GPU and CPU, and then deep partnerships with TSMC, which is required to get the power performance advantage. So this is a slide showcasing the core again. Qualifier, these are AMD slides. We'll go into my data in a bit. However, they're saying that TSMC 5, their N5 variant versus Intel 7 on Alder Lake, with the Golden Cove cores, with the P cores there, they're about 50% less area and 47% more energy efficient. So this is, they're showing a lot of, these sorts of comparisons. And then, yeah, Zen 4 again, up to 62% lower power for the same performance, or 47% more performance, same power. Depends on the test. Generation to generation, don't forget you've also got DDR5 and PCIe 5. So, and then more slides that say the same thing. And then if we look sort of future, we've got Zen 4 now. We're going to have Zen 4 with 3D V cache, and then Zen 4C. That's going to go in the cloud. You may have heard of the Bergamo product. AMD hasn't been clear exactly what the 4nm bit means, whether that's just a minor update in the metal stack or the process, or whether that's actually going to be a fully generational product. We could see that in the edge versions of EPYC, for example, what they now call Sienna. And then Zen 5 with 3D cache, and Zen 5C coming by the end of 2024, which is about right. So let's move on. Yeah, lots of marketing speak, ambitious goals, next gen enthusiast platform. So this is platform speak. So AM4 socket, that's the Ryzen 5000 and earlier. We know this, one socket, 5 CPU architectures, 4 process nodes, 125 processors. AMD said that one of the biggest issues they had is actually the being able to support so many generations. And the big part of that was the minimum specification for the BIOS chip was 8 meg. Now they're mandating that the minimum specification for the new generation is 16 meg. So it should be good for quote unquote 125 processors. Now, the BIOS has to have the algorithms to detect families of processors, and it's the number of families which matters. So if you don't have enough space on your BIOS chip to store the code to be able to detect the families, that's your limitation. We may have a future where we have a configurable BIOS chip where you can either have a 16, 32, 64, 128 meg, and if you go for the 128 meg editions, then maybe it'll support more generations. Interestingly enough, I'm under the impression that the BIOS chips use NOR flash, so we'll see about that. So that's AM4, and now we're on to AM5. So we're going up to 1718 pins, that's the official count, 230 watts in a socket, DDR5 only, there's going to be no DDR4 in this, and that's a good thing. And PCIe 5, and there'll be variants within PCIe 5, works with 98% of AM4 coolers. Excuse me. The mounting holes are roughly the same, but due to some of the power delivery requirements, I think it is, or some of the key power zones, there are a couple of coolers that may not cut it. So we've already seen announcements from Noctua saying that 2 of their coolers will need updated kits, and they'll ship them out for free. Other vendors will do what they do. And yeah, and you may have seen this. We've got 4 different types of chipsets to begin with, at least. you've got the X670 and the B650, and then you have extreme editions of that, which are essentially more guaranteed PCIe 5 support and better minimum specifications for overclocking and pushing the boundary. The X670 boards will be available from tomorrow. I believe the 600 series boards are coming in a couple of weeks. I've heard October 4th being bandied about, but I don't think AMD's either confirmed or said that yet. And then PCIe 5 SSDs are coming to market later this year. And yeah, I've already spoken with the Phison rep. They seem to be pretty much ready to go. It's just a case of building out volume. So SSD is now with 13 gigabytes a second bandwidth. Should be coming. So new socket, yes, you're going to have to upgrade for this. That's a good thing. Again, what I said with the CPU core, it helps redefine the baseline. So this redefines the baseline under DDR5 and with some PCIe 5 support. And they're going straight in at DDR5 5200, if I recall correctly. Now, this is EXPO. You'll be hearing a lot about EXPO. EXPO is essentially AMD's version of XMP. Now, XMP, Intel's extreme memory profiles. What Intel did with the what's called the EEPROM on the memory modules is designate a space for XMP that was proprietary, and then the motherboard BIOS could look at that proprietary code, have the decode information, and then be able to run those modules on XMP enabled boards. AMD doesn't officially have the capability to decode that XMP information, or doesn't have the license to do it. So when you were enabling XMP equivalent on AMD, all you were doing was the base reading of the primary subtimings of that memory kit. You weren't reading the tertiary, you weren't reading the secondary, weren't reading the tertiary, weren't reading anything extra that goes beyond that. What EXPO does is, because the size of the EEPROM on DDR5 modules is bigger by specification, they have designated a space in that they are using for EXPO. So in the same way that Intel XMP has its own space on the EEPROM, EXPO will have its own space on the EEPROM, and instead of enabling XMP, you enable EXPO. So there may be a future where we have, at least for the first few months, DDR5 memory kits that are either XMP or EXPO. What I expect will happen is, because they reside in different spaces of memory, we'll have both XMP and EXPO memory profiles on the same kits. AMD on this launch right now seems to be heavily promoting G.Skill memory kits. I know every reviewer has got G.Skill kits. They seem to be initially validated on G.Skill, or G.Skill's just been, gung-ho. And AMD EXPO stands for Extended Profiles for Overclocking. This comes about because, well, part of it is that DDR5 also now has user configurable SPD profiles. They have 5, aside from the standard SPD profiles, you have 5 configurable ones. All 5 can be configured by the memory vendor, and 2 can be user configured. XMP is meant to be above that, and EXPO is meant to be above that as well. So, and then yeah, DDR5, we already know about DDR5 benefits over DDR4, but AMD is saying that with EXPO, again, like XMP, it's just one click, overclocking memory, of course, because any XMP profile and any EXPO profile, you are overclocking the memory controller. Latency of DDR5 down to 63 nanoseconds, and public certification reports on the memory, not on the motherboard, but on the memory. Should probably ask more into that to make sure it's confirmed. But yeah, 15 kits at launch. Like I say, G.Skill's the one that I seem to have been interacting with the most. But ADATA, Corsair, Geil, Kingston, in a range of RGB to suit your tastes, up to speeds up to DDR5 6400. Though I think I've already seen 6600 or 6800 from G.Skill already mentioned in press releases. So it is what it is. AM5 motherboards starting from $125 US. We'll go a bit more into the chipset definition of these motherboards when we get to the second slide deck. But yeah, It's planned support through 2025 plus. So you guaranteed Zen 5s, so Zen 5 support. So you're probably going to get Zen 4 APUs, Zen 5 APUs. It says plus. There's no guarantee that it'll support the Zen 6 CPUs when they come out, though we can wait and see. The reason why AMD is being a bit cagey here is because that far out, you're speaking, say, again, 2025, 2026, you need to have a very good grasp over what the processor power capabilities need to be, whether you're actually developing new features inside that processor, say you're doing chip on wafer type integration or something, that may necessitate a new socket based on either pin count or memory support or just physical space. One of my criticisms on this launch is I think this chip is too small, because it's only got 2 chiplets on there. Fitting a third of the same size is going to be difficult unless you move things around. If you move things around, you may have thermal issues and requirements. So there is that. We can go into that a bit later. And then, yeah, again, goals over Ryzen 5000 against 1200K, 11% faster core, 44% more compute for creators, and 47% greater energy efficiency. We'll go into my numbers later. And then the pricing. You should have all seen the pricing. $700 for the top end chip, $550 for the 12 core, $400 for the Ryzen 7, and $300 for the Ryzen 5. The Ryzen 5 is going to have the biggest issue competing against Intel right now. 7950X against Alder Lake does really well. Again, we'll go into those numbers. Against Raptor Lake 13th gen, we'll have to see when those come out, and how price competitive that is. And then they went on to some, RDNA 3 stuff during the presentation. And we'll see more of that later. But yeah, first desktop PC processor in 5 nanometers. I'm pretty sure Qualcomm might disagree with you, though they could say that's a laptop, not a desktop PC. Though I'm pretty sure I could put one of those. Anyway, yeah, and AM5. And we'll go into some of the data. This is AMD's new slogan, together we advance, _, and then after that, you'll either have PCs, laptops, gaming, and what have you, and we'll see a lot more of that as time goes on. Here are some footnotes. I'll leave these on the screen for a few seconds, so if people want to shop these and pick them apart, be my guest. I don't necessarily care too much about footnotes when I get these presentations because I tend not to believe what the vendors are telling me. I'm in that position where I can do that sort of thing. Okay, so here is the next set of slides. Let me... can I just put it like that? Yeah. Okay, so now we're going on to SoC microarchitecture. And this we did with Mike Clark, who you may remember is the father of Zen. I've got an interview with Mike Clark. You should definitely go check that out. And Will Harris, who was in charge of the platform, I believe. So Zen journey continues. Higher IPC, high frequency, higher amount of L2, and integrated RDNA2 graphics in the I/O die, which we'll go into. So design goals, again, because Zen 4 is an update to Zen 3, design goals are slightly different to when you redesign the baseline. Excuse me. But performance, latency, efficiency, if you're not targeting all 3, you're not developing a good processor. And then Ryzen 7000 series SoC, new Zen 4 core, 6 nanometer I/O die, now built at TSMC, designed to be lower power, and platform enhancements. Starting with the Zen 4 core. Okay, so we'll go into the exact numbers later. If you've never seen a core diagram, a modern x86 core, both of them, either Intel or AMD, kind of looks like this. So I'm not sure if you can actually see my my mouse pointer, probably not knowing me. Let's see if I can enable it. No, probably not. Anyway, what we have here is at the top right, we have the branch prediction. So when you want to branch and predict data, that's where you go. Instructions are in the iCache, 32 kilobyte 8-way. They can either go through decode or they go into the op cache. Now, the op cache or micro op cache is a cache of pre-decoded instructions, and if they appear again, the system can recognize that. So instead of taking the power to decode them again, it can just say, well, we can just say that we can add this to the op cache and say one of these needs to go in this order. What we have is the decode is still 4 instructions per cycle. I was really betting that they'd be moving up to 6 instructions per cycle. It looks like that's more of a Zen 5 discussion point. But the op cache is going up from 8 macro ops per cycle to 9 macro ops per cycle. Now, I said micro ops earlier. The difference between macro ops and micro ops is because what's not listed in this diagram is decode and rename, which happens around the same time as the micro op queue. So what this means is when you send an instruction to a CPU, it has to decode it into smaller operations for the core to recognize. It's the own internal ISA. Most operations actually map one-to-one. However, depending on the out-of-order scheduling of those operations, you may be able to fuse them together, or you may have to crack them. Or some complex operations, say a very long-winded AVX512, like an RD seed, where you're trying to start your own random number generator in the CPU. That actually decodes to multiple, if not tens or hundreds of instructions, especially in the case of RD seed, because the idea is that that's the only operations you need, and depending on whether the system can process your instruction in 1 micro-op or 3 micro-ops, which is a big part of what AMD is doing on AVX512 here over Intel, depends on how much that buffer is used. So, quick insight into what I believe CPUs do. So we have larger op cache. This is a 50%, more than 50% higher. It's going from 4K to 6.75K. So it's a 50% plus a 500 plus a 500 plus a 250. Benefits of using smaller transistors is that in the same physical area you can pack in more. That's a benefit of that. So from the micro queue, we have 6 operations dispatched into the integer and floating point. Ignore the fact that there are 8 arrows going from integer rename down to the schedulers and only 1 arrow from floating point rename into the schedulers. I asked Mike about that, and he said, no, that's just a diagrams issue thing. So larger instruction retire queue, larger integer and floating point register files, which is you're about just below halfway down the page on the right. They're minor updates. Power efficient AVX support in the floating point unit. So again, we're going to that, but rather than implementing a full AVX 512 unit, they're essentially taking 2 256-bit execution ports and then pushing 2 instructions through that. AMD call it double pumped. I really hate the term double pumped because Intel used to use it when they were doing some of their parts of their core at double frequency. So I'm not going to say double pumped. I'm just going to say doubling the instructions in order to support. And then additional load store improvements, and the L2 cache is moving up from 512K to 1 gig. So at a high level, there's your microarchitecture improvements. Then we go into the front end advances. The branch prediction, we can now predict 2 taken branches per cycle. That's helped supported by larger branch target buffers, because when you're trying to determine what data or what instructions you need buffers to do that. So larger buffers, larger op cache, I said, and then 9 macro op. Are we coming back? It's not updated on my end. It says I'm streaming. Okay. Now we're back. So So hopefully you don't hear, but I've had to put my laptop fans on to full. If you've not been following my issues with this laptop, I put a PCI for one of the first gen PCI 4 SSDs in this, and it seems to like to overheat. I turn the fan down because the stream, it shouldn't be on, because I didn't want the fan to be picked up by the microphone, but I've had to turn the fan on full. So please do tell me if you can hear the fan, and I'll try and find... no, ironically, this is an AMD laptop. Thing is, I'm the one that screwed it up because this wasn't built for a first-gen PCI 4 SSD. If you remember, those ones were consuming lots of power. I just need to put in a second-gen PCI 4 SSD. That's just my issue. So, you can see it's getting light outside. I'm not sure if... Yeah, okay. This is going to be painful with the slides. OBS, can you let me resize the text elements in your new thing? Because... Okay. Let's go from here. Now, obviously, I've lost all my OBS settings properly. There we go. So, load store advances. Continuing on. So, 20% larger load queue. This is going on from something like 70 to 86 or something. I'll get the exact numbers in a slide later. I know that. Fewer data cache port conflicts. So this just means it can support more instructions per flight that aren't blocking. 50% larger L2 DTLB, and then mostly it's just the baseline from Zen 3. We'll say some of these advances may not have any benefit in the consumer space, but they may be built for the enterprise space. So there is that to think about. Cache hierarchy. So now we're moving up to from a 512K cache to a 1 meg L2 cache. Supports more outstanding misses from L2 to L3 per core, more outstanding misses L3 to memory. But aside from that, it's just a bigger cache. There is some additional latency going to that cache in terms of cycles. Again, I've got data for that. So we'll eventually get to that point. Now, new AVX512 instructions. This happens purely on the floating point section of the pipe. And it supports a lot of the standard AVX512. If you know about AVX512, you'll know that there's about I was going to say 2,000. It's probably about 1,000 instructions now, and they all fall under different headings, and it depends how many flavors you want to support, you end up supporting. What AMD is doing here is implementing that with 256-bit operations, in the same way that the first generation Zen did AVX2 with 128-bit operations. So this means you don't have to go support the super large XYZMM cache requirements. It saves on die area. The downside is you're actually doing double the operations. So that's the trade-off. And ultimately, if those operations support more things, then you get faster overall performance. Let's say no frequency impact using AVX512. I'll talk about that in a bit. And then they've got bfloat 16. And again, this means that AMD is the only processor in the market right now with consumer bfloat 16 support and VNNI support, which Intel already has in overlay. So that is, and these are the instructions supported. If you know your flavors of AVX512, this isn't the full list, I'll tell you that. Again, go check out Alex Yee, and I think the guys over at Ints Latex 64 will also have a deeper dive. But this is essentially what it supports, and again, we've got the numbers that we spoke through earlier. There's no VP2 intersect, for example, and I might think there may be some more supported that is specifically for server stuff. We'll see. This is a bit they may expand in the firmware for the EPICs, so we'll see. And yeah, I'll go over the reason why my data shows a 6x speed up, not a 1.3x. And again, this is the graph for the Zen 4 IPC, showing how they calculated 13%. There's no spec here. That really frustrates me. And then this graph, which we saw before. So there is some virtualization and security enhancements. APIC extends to X2 APIC, and more speculative control functionality. And so if you're into this and you know a lot more about it than I do, clearly, than I do at 6:45 in the morning. So here we have some of the raw numbers. If you're interested in exactly what the differences are, Zen 3 to Zen 4, we've got, the load store queue is increased from 72 to 88. The store queue is unchanged. Micro-op cache, or the Merco-op cache, goes from 4K to 6.75K, which I said earlier. L2 cache is up to 1 meg. L2 TLB goes from 2K entries to 3K entries. The L2 latency goes from 12 to 14 cycle. We'll go into that. And the L3 latency goes from 46 cycle to 50 cycle. We'll go into that as well. So there is some additional latency penalty in L2 and L3 in terms of cycles. Issue width stays the same. Insta register again, that scales up, just over 10%. Fine point register goes up a bit more than 10%. Reorder buffer 256 320. That makes it more competitive with Intel, though I think Apple's still around 500, so they're not competitive with Apple there. No raw changes in instruction performance for the base FAD, FML, FMA latencies, though there are a lot of latency changes for the AVX512 stuff, obviously. And L1 and L2 branch target buffers increased slightly. The L1 by 50%, the L2 by a little bit. And thanks to everyone in the chat who's keeping everyone up to date, because I'm kind of motoring through this, kind of on purpose. So I'm not paying too much attention to chat. Sorry. Hi, Albert. So new 6nm Ryzen 7000 series IO die, going from GlobalFoundries 6nm, 12nm to TSMC's 6nm. It has RDNA 2 graphics. This is 2 compute units. This is literally the minimum specification of compute that they'll put into it. Optimized AMD fabric. Now, so this is quite important, and I'll go into a little bit here. The AMD fabric in this generation is significantly updated. What they've done is kept it at the same speed, same bandwidth overall, but they've halved the number of Infinity Fabric links from the I/O die to the core, but they're running at double the frequency. So half the links, double the frequency. The bandwidth is the same. What this allows them to do is actually save power, because that link, the way I understand it, the power was more mandated by how many link terminals you had on the other end. So they're saying that even though you're doubling the frequency, and usually doubling the frequency requires a lot more than double the power, they're saying that they actually save power by halving the links and doubling the frequency over that SerDes length. So that's really interesting. It does perhaps mean that in the future, especially on the enterprise side, we may end up with double Infinity Fabric if they went to the full width and decided to burn more power that way. We may see power optimized Infinity Fabric versions of EPIC, where you've either got double Infinity Fabric between the cores or half Infinity Fabric between the cores. So that would be something to look out for. Trade-off is the cores will have less core frequency as a result. DDR5 up to JDEC 5200 with ECC support. This generation, and I know I've banged on about it intermittently, but the last generation, ECC was listed but not verified. This time it's actually verified as part of the platform. So if you also have a motherboard with ECC support, you may have seen Linus's video recently about Intel saying that you can only have it on W series motherboards, workstation motherboards. That is up to the manufacturer, and it'll to limit it to the chipset, and AMD also has that ability to limit it. They've turned around and said, if you want dedicated ECC support, you need to find motherboards that actually verify it. Not only that, ECC is good, but you also need a system that actually detects and reports the errors. And those tend to be on the enterprise type motherboards. If you have a consumer motherboard that has ECC, it may only be that it says ECC yes, but you won't ever see how many errors it finds, because it will just funnel them away in a log file to nowhere. So bear that in mind. 28 lanes of PCI Express 5, so that's 16 for the GPU, 2 lots of 4 for storage, and 4 for the chipset, if I remember correctly. USB BIOS flashback is now part of the platform. It's actually supported natively in the chipset. Previously, motherboard vendors had to have their own external solutions, and AMD said there will likely also, those vendors will likely still use their own internal solutions because they've customized around that. Not every motherboard has to have a form of USB BIOS flashback. It's like not every motherboard has to use all the USB ports that the chipset provides. AMD is just saying here that it's an option for the motherboard vendors to use, and what they essentially want to do is bring it into a more sort of mid to lower price point. It may not be on the ultimate low end motherboards, but they expect it to definitely be there in the mid range, and at kind of quote unquote no extra cost to the motherboard vendors. But again, motherboard vendors have already put the sunk cost into the development. And then last point on this slide is low power methodologies from Ryzen 6000 series mobile. They said that at the time that what they used at 6 nanometers for Ryzen 6000 mobile, which is what this is actually, they're put into future products, and that's all to do with guardrail management and voltage management and low power state support. Go look at my reviews for that. The RDNA 2 graphics, so no AV1 encode yet. We have to wait for the RDNA 3 versions probably. But AV1 decode, but it still has H.264 and HVC. This will not be enough for... I don't want to say it won't be enough for streaming. I've not tested it for streaming, but we'll see. DisplayPort 2 support, HDMI 2.1 support, USB Type-C support. So this actually supports 3 displays. I think they've actually got it later in the deck. I'll stick to talking about that later in the deck. And when it says hybrid graphics support, that just means you can plug monitors in. So you don't need to have to determine whether you want to use desktop displays or the motherboard displays. You can choose offline. And then platform enhancements. Socket AM5. Same package size, more pins, DDR5, 28 lanes. Okay, display interfaces. So the display engines, you can have 4 of them. Not 3, 4, I misspoke. One of them is dedicated, so that's either HDMI or DisplayPort. The other 3 are Type-C, unless the motherboard vendor uses a Type-C to DisplayPort converter. A lot of people pointed out that this is slightly frustrating because how many USB Type-C motherboards out there, and Type-C to X adapters are still pretty expensive. AMD said it's more to do with the fact that you can have them as USB 3.2 ports or as DisplayPort ports, DisplayPort over Type-C. So there's that. It kind of consolidates some of the rear I/O so you can put more USB ports and other stuff in there. And then updates to the I2C and the SM bus. Audio has some improvements. I didn't actually dive deep into that. I'll leave that to experts to go into that. And platform power control updated to SVI 3, which is what we saw on Ryzen 6. So AMD socket, the AM5 power delivery improvements. One thing here you'll see is it looks like that the minimum amount of power phases for these CPUs is going to be about 12. I'd be surprised if I see 8, maybe 8 of like the 90 or 105 amp ones, but 12 is going to be what you're going to see on a lot of motherboards. But what they're saying here is that due to SVI 3, they can do a lot more monitoring of the platform. And so power improvements, this is reiterating the slide before with 35, 37, and 75%. They're using Cinebench R23NT for that data. So it's important to note that they're saying, when they say TDP, what they really want to focus on is socket power. So here we have the chipsets. Now, I don't like this sort of diagram. And if I told AMD at the time, and a lot of people did, that this diagram kind of sucks. What you see, so let's start on the left. CPU has 4 3.2 10 gig ports, 28 PCIe 5, which is 16 graphics, 8 NVMe, and 4 chipset downlink, though those chipset lanes are configured to Gen 4, because the chipset only supports Gen 4. What this may mean is we may see Gen 5 chipsets on, say, 700 series or 800 series, depending on how long the platform lasts. They're essentially putting that in place such that if you put this CPU in a 7 or 800 series chipset that may support a PCIe Gen 5 chipset, then this will also support the chipset of PCIe Gen 5. I actually didn't realize that until I just read it. So that is what it is. And then a USB 2 port, which is more like a debug port. Then over onto the chipset, a PCIe 4x4 interface. Now, AMD is using a chiplet design for its chipsets. There is one standard configuration of chipset. The 600 series has 2 of them, and they're daisy-chained. The 670 series will have 2 of them, and they're daisy-chained. The 660 will only have 1 of them. What I don't like about this diagram is it doesn't show the upstream chipset, as you see here, and downstream chipset, what's connected to what. You're going to have to look at your motherboard manual and the chipset diagrams to find that out. But either way, on the X670 and X670E, you get lots of ports, lots of USB ports, you get lots of PCIe 4 lanes, and then at the back end, you can have up to 8 SATA ports natively supported. We're going to see that a lot of these flexible I/O type ports won't be used, though we'll see a lot more motherboards with 3 NVMe slots for what it is. There were some complaints about, well, if you have all this high-speed storage and it's daisy chained down, then you're going to have upstream limitations in terms of bandwidth. That is true. However, the, say, 10 gig Ethernet that you put on and the USB ports will only saturate the link if you're running multiple of them at a time and it's like pure sequential transfer. How often are you just simply always transferring through the chipset? They're called PCI switches or PCI muxes for a reason. So that is, and then the B650 and 650E is just a cut down version. You'll see that it's still saying the processor has PCIe 5. Exactly which the graphics or the NVMe are PCIe 5 depends on the chipset version. So X670E, you get everything. I think it's X670. You also get you at least get the GPU and the storage. With B650E, I said 660 earlier. That's my bad. With the B series, the Extreme, you get the GPU and the storage, and with the non-Extreme, you don't get the storage, or you may not even get the GPU. It becomes highly variable. Just check before you buy a motherboard. Go to the vendor's website and check the manual. The manuals have gone pretty good over the years, and I used to review lots of motherboards. But yeah, here's a breakdown of the 7000 series platform, and we've gone through all of this. And then footnotes again, yeah, if you want to screenshot these or whatever, go right ahead. Yeah, it's literally cut off at the end there, so that's not me. And then these as well, codenamed RPL, of course. And there's a disclaimer. SoC extra slides here, SoC topology with two CCDs and the IO die, showing where the reads and writes are. I think this diagram is important. If you ever want to explain to somebody what F clock is, what L clock is, what U clock is, then this is the diagram to show them, because you've also got mem clock and everything else. This is a good diagram to show them, actually. So there is that. Okay, the next one is going to be my benchmarking stuff. So 40 minutes, we almost an hour in, and let's start talking about my benchmark data. I'll go through it as it's just being populated in my stuff. So that's going to be weird. Hold on, let's see if I can change that. And slide. No. View graphs. Let's see if I can. This might be. I'm sorry. This is just what happens when you save things as PNGs. Clearly. So this is the core power on a POV Ray test. So System Vision Ray. It's typically what we use to load the CPU. However, this generation is going to be a bit different when it comes to loading. The important things to note here, at idle, we've got a package power of 21 watts. That's right at the bottom left. And then at one core, the single core power is 18 watts. Previous generations on AMD, we were at 20, I think approaching 25. So the fact that this is 18 is actually pretty good. Then you can see the gradual decline as we add in, the load going from left to right, 2-core, 3-core, 4-core load. What I will point out here is that in previous generations with the multiple chiplet design, when we crossed over from 8 cores to 9 cores, so 8 cores on one chiplet, 1 core on the other, because that's how I limit the cores in this scenario, we would see that extra core actually having less power resources, and we'd see a very clear delineation between that core and the others, and that would continue through to actually 16 cores. We'd see that one chiplet was kind of getting more power than the other. It kind of balanced out as you went down to all 16 cores, but it was very distinctive. This situation, though, AMD seems to have evened out the power. It actually looks really nice from here. Going down to 11 watts per core when you've got all cores loaded. That means you're using 180 watts. I haven't added the decimal places because I think it makes the graph a bit too cluttery. But in terms of total package power on POV Ray, 206 watts, not 230. So remember that. Let's see here. Okay, so this is going to require some explaining. What we have here is the frequency when running POV Ray. Now, what I've done is, what I do is I run an 8K test, 8K POV render test, and after about a minute, I then take the data, the CPU frequency, the thermals, and that's essentially where the point lies in this test. When 0 cores are loaded, we get 3.6 gigahertz on the cores, and the CPU is running at 40 degrees. That's what that 40 means. With 1 core, we didn't see 5.7 gigahertz. We saw 5475. And the CPU is hitting 80 degrees. Now, in the data, it said that there are a few cores running at 5475. So this could be just Windows playing silly buggers, but it was pretty consistent. I'll go into a bit more about where the AMD's numbers of 5.7 go into. But you can actually see a slow decline that in this test, we actually get 5 gigahertz all core. You will see it hits 95 degrees pretty early on. at pretty much at 7 cores all loaded, and anything above 90 is when you hit 5 cores loaded with a full workload like POV. I prefer POV to Cinebench just because it taxes it a little bit more, taxes the core a little bit more. I have been speaking to experts in this area from multiple companies, and they're saying that now with the future generation processors, we are no longer really going to be limited on the high end by the frequency of the core. We're going to be limited by the current provided and the temperature. These CPUs are designed to run well beyond 95 degrees, well beyond 105 degrees. And the warranty is actually spec'd, I think, at 105. But they will be tested beyond that because AMD will have a sliding scale and Intel will do the same. What they've got here is that the CPU will automatically regulate at 95 degrees by adjusting the current, by adjusting the power. That being said, you may think, well, that's a very sharp drop-off. In this graph, look at the 8-core value. 95 degrees, 5.1 gigahertz on those active cores. You add in 8 more cores, and you only lose 100 megahertz. You're still at 95 degrees. You haven't gone above that in temperature. So, and to Joto's point, yes, this is all automated on my end, because it would be mind-numbing if it wasn't. But the point here is there's going to be a lot of scare tactics with these processors saying, oh, they run super hot, they run at 95 degrees, rah, rah, rah. But the point is, you're not losing pretty much any frequency here. 100 megahertz from 8 cores, 60 watts. I will specify this. This is the Ryzen 9 7950X. 170 watt TDP, 230 watt package power tracking. In this case, it only hit about 206, 207 watts. I was using a Noctua DH15 dual fan, the literally highest end air cooler you can buy, aside from the 2 kilo thermal right coppers that I have, that I don't have an AM5 bracket for. This is literally the best air cooler you can get, and 95 degrees at 8 cores, but only a small drop in frequency when you hit that. So bear that in mind. Bear that in mind. A lot of people will say a lot of stuff about it. I've said my piece. When I get around to actually filming the full review that I've scripted, we'll go into that. So I want to take you through some data, power data, just so we flesh this out a bit. So this is my Agisoft benchmark. Now, for those of you who are new, who don't know my benchmark suite, Agisoft is a tool that converts 2D images to 3D models and textures them. Excuse me. So it's a 4-stage benchmark. Some of it is single thread, some of it is multi-thread, some of it is memory bandwidth limited. It tests a wide range. Now, at the start, we actually see the peak in power, 201 watts, and a rise to a 94 degrees Celsius peak. However, during the main work bit of the benchmark, that's sort of from 200 to 900 seconds, that's where it's fully multi-threaded. We're only drawing 170 watts average, and we're only seeing 87 degrees on the CPU. Frequency, we're at 5.2 gigahertz, 5231, that's sustained. And then in the second half of the benchmark, we actually do see the CPU rise to 5.7 gigahertz. 5732 in this case. That was pretty much the highest I saw. I know some people have said in the CPU that actually 5850 is the highest that you can go to. That depends on a number of factors. Actually, do I want to talk about this specifically here or on a later slide? Yeah, let's talk about this here because it's relevant and it will come into the next slide. So when you run instructions and data through a core, you have different workloads will test the core in different amounts. Some workloads are very branch heavy. Some can be decoded very easily, like CPU-Z, like Cinebench, like 3D particle movement, which we'll see in a bit. Some of them attack the front end of the CPU, some of them target the back end of the CPU, some of them are cache heavy, some of them really target the reorder buffer, some of them the branch target buffers, some of them the L1 cache, some of them the L2 cache. And the point is, different sets of instructions put different pressure on the core. If you know your instructions, you'll know that the basis instruction you can do is called a no-op, literally a no operation. This comes into the core, goes straight through to microop cache because it's a no-op. No-op essentially means do nothing. You can run your CPU at 100% utilization, or your system will say 100% just with no-ops. That's when it will run at 5.7 gigahertz. When you start putting math through it, addition, subtraction, multiplication, something a bit more complicated like a branch prediction, then you're going to get a slight decrease in that frequency. In the past, that frequency used to be fixed, especially with Intel and their turbo tables, which you're probably all very intimately familiar with. I know I am. AMD was a bit more free-floating based on how much power the core needed and what the frequency would be. We'd call it a floating turbo. This is essentially an extension of that based on what instructions you're running. Now, you may think, well, this is like AVX 512. The first generations, we had it on Intel, where if you're using an AVX 512, it would reduce the core frequency. Difference between that and this is that was an automatic decrease. If you used an AVX 512 instruction, it would immediately say reduce 700 megahertz, and that's it. AMD here is being very dynamic, and to the point where your turbo frequency on the single core, at least, though I'll get more into some benchmarks where it seemingly doesn't matter in the data. But if you're specifically looking for that 5.7 gigahertz, A, you may not be running the right instructions, or B, it may be occurring on a timescale that you can't detect. So the point is that CPUs can change frequency in microseconds, right? They can ramp up in microseconds, they can ramp down in microseconds. Again, got some data to show that. Those super high frequencies may only occur in that sort of time frame scenario because the current draw is so high. Going back to what I said earlier about the current draw may be the limiting factor of platforms going forward, and we won't see CPUs listed as purely as TDP in watts. We'll actually see it in terms of the current supported as well, and that's also a motherboard issue. So that's my caveat on the fact that you may not see 5.7 gigahertz on these processors. We kind of similar sort of seen it with the thermal velocity boost on Intel's KS CPUs. So keep that all in mind. And yes, gaming is a different beast. So just to clarify, I'm not doing any gaming tests in this. I'm just doing purely CPU tests. I said that at the beginning, didn't I? But so here we have a AVX 512 workload, and I realize my camera's going in and out, and just because it's brightening up outside. So this is my 3D particle movement AVX 512 test. This was optimized several years ago by an AVX 512 guru, Ninja, the programming ninjas, who coincidentally now works at Apple. But he used to work at Intel, and so Intel, they took the code, they optimized it, they sent it to me. And that was optimized for AVX2 and AVX 512. So it just detects which is the largest, which is the most recently, the best supported on the processor, and then runs that code path. AMD asked for this code about 2 years ago now, and I gave it to them, and I said, "Look, this is how it is," and they said, "Yes, thank you very much," and I never heard from them about it again. So clearly, it was fine. But interesting things to point out here is, so this is all core frequency. 5.1 gigahertz is the peak we saw. It goes down to about 5 at the end. This workload, it's 3D particle movement, so it's random Brownian motion, Monte Carlo type stuff. And it's running 6 different movement algorithms for 20 seconds, then rest for 10. 20 seconds, and rest for 10. And so here we have the first run of that, essentially. We're seeing 5.1 gigahertz all core at 227 watts. So there's your 230 package power tracking. It did it initially. But you'll see the temperature very quickly rose to 95. And so we got a slight decrease in power and a slight decrease in frequency. Again, only 100 megahertz as it ramped up the temperature. And, you know, there's slight different variations because some of these instructions are more aggressive than others, but it is what it is. And I think that's that's a really nice test. And so now we come on to just a very simple POV-rate 8K. This is the version of the frequency versus cores loaded. This is just all cores loaded. And as you see, we've got an all-core frequency. This is a separate test to that test, and it just happened that it was 5006. And it instantly went up to 95 degrees, 207 watts for the whole test, and done. So. And here we have core-to-core latency. This is again another one of the tests that I like doing. Let's see if it's okay. Let's put it more into the center. And because we have two chiplets, this is just essentially bouncing cache lines in the L3 between the cores in nanoseconds. So within a chiplet, you're looking at anywhere from 14 to 18 nanoseconds. It's actually more like 15 to 18. I will say that that's very regular. Previous generations of AMD, this would vary between 12 and 18. So the fact that this is 15 to 18 flat, more flat than usual, is very good. What's even more surprising here is that going off chiplet. So going off chiplet was always weird because you'd cross multiple frequency boundaries and that could vary your time depending on what power states they were in. In this case, when you go to the L3 of another core, your latency now is anywhere from about 75 to 79 nanoseconds. Again, that was a much wider range before. One of the things that Zen 4 has done, the improved Infinity Fabric has done at least in that case, is made the variation less. This is important for Epic because in the server world, you're looking at minimum response or 99% response times, what they call SLA or QoS, quality of service. You need to keep those up to a maximum. The latency needs to be as low as possible. So the fact that these are more equal is actually really good. Here we have a frequency ramp, just making the workload, the detection of the frequency, the workload that causes the frequency bump. And I split it in here. The y-axis with time is actually set because 16.66 milliseconds is 60 FPS. So 8.33 is 120. And we can see that we get a frequency response to peak turbo, in this case, again, 5.45 roughly. Within one frame of 120 frame window. So it is. And there's the logo of the company that I just had in this diagram. Okay, memory latency. So memory latency, what we do here is, if you're not used to talking about cache and memory latency, imagine it as a very long road. And say you only wanted to go 8 kilobytes down the road. Well, then, okay, you hit an L1. If you want to go 256 kilobytes down the road, you'll hit an L2. If you want to go 2 megabytes down the road, you'll hit an L3. And it's kind of that, depends on how far you have to go out and then come back. That determines your latency here. And this graph I've got measured in cycles, right? So this is how many clock cycles of the core it takes to get there. The L1 is 4 cycles between Zen 3 and Zen 4, so we're looking at generational differences here. L2, say AMD said that we're going from, say, 12 cycle to 14 cycle. In our test, we're going from about 10 to 11 cycle to 14 cycles. That's a fairly big jump. So your L2 in terms of cycles is slower. But I'll get on to why that kind of matters, kind of doesn't later. And then you see this, the dashed blue line is Zen 4. And you'll see between about 512 and 1024 kilobytes, about in the middle of the graph, it's very much under where Zen 3 is. That's because we've got a 1 meg L2 cache rather than a 512 kilobyte L2 cache. And the reason why it's more of a gradient than a straight up, that's due to the cache buffers and the TLVs. But what we're seeing here is that the L3 cache, AMD said, goes from 56 to 50 cycles. We're actually measuring it at about the same 45 to 72 cycles. And then, according to this graph, it looks like that when you go beyond that to DRAM, there's a little bit of extra latency. But we'll go into why this graph is a bit weird. If we convert those numbers from cycles to nanoseconds based on the frequency, the graph looks like this, which has Zen 4 winning at every level, right? So the L1, the faster single core frequency means that the L1 cache is 0.1 of a nanosecond quicker going to Zen 4. The L2 cache, because of the uptick in cycles, but the uptick in cycles, but the uptick in frequency kind of cancel each other out, so it's still 2.4 nanoseconds. Then we go to the L3, and we're actually saying about 8% here with 9.2 nanoseconds at the bulk of that L3. You still get the major benefit in that 512 to 1 meg window. And then as we go out to main memory, we're going from 75 nanoseconds to 66 nanoseconds. AMD said about 65 to, I think 63, 65 when you use EXPO. So we're seeing good numbers here. We're seeing good numbers here. So the point is, are you cycle limited or are you just pure raw latency limited? And the further you go out, you end up being more latency limited than cycle limited. So, and then we get onto the benchmarking tests. Hang on, this seems like an yeah. We'll cover this one multiple times, I guess. So this is my 3D particle movement 2.1 AVX workload. So if you've got a CPU with AVX2, it uses AVX2. If you've got a CPU with AVX512, it uses AVX512. With the new Zen 4 Ryzen 7000 processors, it has AVX512. So you can see here the Ryzen 9 and the Ryzen 5 get uplifted quite a lot. The only Intel CPU with the AVX512, officially, I'm saying officially here, was the 11th gen. And yeah, we see the difference between the 6 core and the 8 core. It's AMD has a bit more efficiency here than the 16 core is just off the scale. And yeah, the reason why we're getting 66,000 here compared to previous generation, we're only getting about 10,000, so 6.6x increase. I actually had this scripted out. Let's see if I can bring it up, because I did a really good explanation on this myself. If I don't say so myself. Okay, I'm going to read this. Okay, so some people may wonder why this improvement for AVX 512 is 6x, not 2x, as AVX 512 is only 2x over AVX2, which is 256-bit. The reason is because AVX2 is actually quite limited. There are a lot of features not in AVX2 which can be accelerated in AVX 512. So for the CPUs that can run AVX2, is actually a mix of AVX2 and then AVX code, where AVX2 doesn't have specific instructions. AVX 512 has over 1,000 instructions compared to AVX2, which only has a couple of hundred. It's because AVX 512 is so broad, some parts of the workload, yes, do get improved by 2x, but some are improved by a lot more than 2x. And my 3D particle movement benchmark here is one of those. You get a very substantial speed up going to AVX 512. I mean, you do get a lot more speed up going to GPUs, but that's what it is. So, just to clarify, the following benchmark numbers you'll see. I've got the Ryzen 9 7950X and the Ryzen 5 7600X, which I got as samples for the review. In terms of AMD, I've got the 5950X and the 3950X because they're both 16 core. I've got the Ryzen 5 5600X because that gives 6 core gen on gen performance, and I've also added the V cache just because the V cache adds in certain scenarios where that's relevant. For Intel, I've included the Old Lake 12900K, then we've got the 11th 900K, the 10900K, the 9900K, and the 8700K. So that's 6, 8, 10, 8 plus 8 core chips. And the order of those is going to get very confusing. But that's what I've put through these tests here. So this is the Geekbench 5 single-threaded test. This is what AMD had in its slide deck. And we're seeing clear wins in the single-threaded for the new Zen 4 processors. Obviously, Old Lake here is just touching above 1900. People say that they get 2,000. This is just what I get. For some reason I'm the world's worst overclocker because I get worse in stock. That just seems to be a thing that happens to me. So it is what it is. What we're seeing here is a sizable uplift from previous gen Ryzen 9 to current gen Ryzen 9. 1655 to 2232. Yeah, I'll take that any day. Again, a lot of that is single core frequency. Even if you are or may not hitting 5.7, it's still great to go up to 5.5, 5.4. And then obviously the Ryzen 5 7600X does that as well. I will say at this point, as I've said before in this stream, I have done the 142 watt and the 65 watt tests, and in single threaded they're pretty much the same. So it's worth keeping a mind in that, an eye in that. So that's single threaded. Multi-threaded because you're at the whim of the cores. Though what's more important here is perhaps the gen on gen increases. In terms of 16 core 5950X, 7950X, you're getting again that sizable uplift. Almost 50% and then 35% over Intel's Alder Lake. But again, Alder Lake is 8 P cores and 8 E cores, so it's kind of not really equivalent to the same degree. If we look at gen on gen with the Ryzen 5 versus Ryzen 5 6 core versus 6 core, there's a good 30% uplift there. So now Cinebench R23 ST. This is again. This is software that doesn't really tax the front end, and that's where AMD has got a lot of its improvements. So what we're seeing here, gen on gen, is going to be a good frequency uplift. The Ryzen 5 matches the Core i9 12900K pretty much, and then the 7950X gets a little bit above that. Multi-threaded, similar sort of story as before, just because you have 16 cores. Again, we get another good 50% improvement from Zen 3 to Zen 4, and the Ryzen 5 6 core to 6 core is a bit more like 35%, maybe a bit less. Agisoft, let's see if I can move it. Yeah. So Agisoft, again, if you didn't see the part of the stream earlier, this is taking 52D images and making a 3D model with textures based on those images. We're looking at time to complete here, measured in seconds. And typically, because it's a variable workload, some aspects it's single thread, some aspects multi-thread, some aspects it's memory limited. We're getting the DDR5 processors hit the top. And I think what's important here is that the 16 core from the last generation, the Ryzen 9 5950X, is getting matched by the 6 core of this generation. So, yeah. I like this data. Next one is, okay, we've seen that graph. I knew it was going to be twice. So NAMD, this is molecular dynamics simulation. I'm using version 2.13 and not the AVX512 version, which is 2.15, because as I understand it, that's still in beta. I didn't actually check before I started running these numbers. When it comes out of beta, I will switch. But for now, I'm sticking with the non-AVX512, so this is still AVX2. This is in Windows. You do get a speed up in Linux over this. I will grant you that. And we're seeing, the Ryzen 9 over Zen 4 over Zen 3, again getting that substantial uplift. And Alder Lake, because it only has 8P cores, can't compete. Dwarf Fortress. This is a 550-year. This is what I call my Dwarf Fortress large benchmark. I do also have smaller medium, but I thought this was one of the better ones to show out of those. The Zen 3 chips were behind, except for the Vcache, and the Zen 4 meets the Vcache. So this is a workload that seems to really like Vcache, but the Ryzen 9 7950X still goes above and beyond. Ryzen 5 7600X goes above Alder Lake. And again, this is more of a single-threaded heavy test. Frequency, cache, works. Dolphin. So this is my Dolphin emulation test. I think I'm actually using a slightly older version of Dolphin at this point. I should probably update. However, this is a test derived a while ago that was essentially, can you do ray tracing in the Dolphin emulator? This essentially does the POV ray test in Dolphin. Again, time to complete. Higher up the graph you are, the faster you are. And Zen 4 comes in, takes the lead. So, Blender. Okay, everybody knows Blender. This, just because of some of the data, again, this is a slightly old version. I think they're on Blender 3 now. Not much has changed, however, but we still get a sizable uplift going from Zen 3 to Zen 4. Again, going from 249 seconds to 171 seconds. That's quite impressive. Again, you still have to manage with power and temperature, but we've discussed a lot of that. Corona 1.3, this is a ray tracing renderer. Sizable generational uplift again. Okay, and this is perhaps the graph I should have led with, because this is the one everybody asked for. Can it play Crysis? Somebody needs to put in the comments of the video, what time are we in? At 1 hour 30, we're talking about, does the CPU run Crysis? What I do for this benchmark, if you haven't seen any of my previous videos that mention it, is I take the GOG version of Crysis and I disable the GPU renderer so we only have a pure CPU renderer. There are some limits with the way that version of Crysis works. The limits is you can either run it 32 threads across 16 cores or 23 threads across 23 cores. In this case, we're running 16 threads, 32 cores. 16 cores, 32 threads for all these chips. And it becomes very much an efficiency workload because you're doing GPU rendering on a CPU. And at 1080p low, we have 22.2 frames per second, which is an uplift over previous generation. And now we have a new leader in this test. So can this CPU run Crysis? Yes, 22 frames a second average. I haven't done anything with, say, the low data, just because the benchmark that it provides just gives you an average. So here's what it is. V-Ray, so AMD also showed V-Ray, and these are the results I get. I got better performance on V-Ray. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier in the stream, if you didn't catch it. There were some BIOS updates for certain motherboards midway through the reviewing process, because some BIOSes for some reason seem to put the F clock at 1500 megahertz, not 3000. That's what it was explained to me what they were doing. So if you get a motherboard, update to the latest BIOS, and you get these results. I mainly saw the deficit in the benchmarking in V-Ray. So 7-zip combined. This is a decompression benchmark, and I think the metric here is MIPS. I can't remember. I've been running it for so long, automated, that I don't actually look at the screen anymore. But again, we're seeing generation on generation uplift due to frequency, power, and core performance updates. Speedometer 2. So this is an interesting test. This is a web test that I run in a version of Chrome that doesn't update. And this is essentially a frames per second equivalent that relies on the CPU being effective at translating web workflows, but also when it comes down to frequency of caching, and it's a single-threaded test. And AMD takes the crown very slightly, but it's interesting to know that the Ryzen 5 matches the Core i9, within a number of 1. So the V-cache here didn't help because it's only at 108, but we're getting, again, sizable gen-on-gen performance uplifts. Now, this is a different sort of test. The rest were kind of seconds or frames or points. This is IDA64's memory test benchmark, but rather than giving you the read-write copy, I've just taken the geometric mean of the read-write copy, and this is megabytes per second. And we're seeing here the difference between DDR4 and DDR5 taking a role. So what we have is the Core i9 and the Ryzen 9 at the top getting about the same result, almost 74 gigabytes per second. Technically, they should be getting nearer 100 gigabytes per second, but there is some overhead. What's interesting to note here is that the single chiplet version, the Ryzen 5, is slightly down on that peak bandwidth. This is part of the restrictions of going from a dual chiplet to a single chiplet. We did see it before. If you take the Zen 3 numbers, the Ryzen 9 5950X, which is at 56, the Ryzen 5 is at 40, there's that sort of 30% difference. It's very much reduced with Zen 4, but there is still a slight difference of going to the dual chip. Are we good to go? Yep. Quick battery change. Yeah. Sorry, was the audio did go massive loud. Sorry. I think we're actually getting to the end of the slideshow now. Okay, no, this is it. Just in time. Good. Okay. Now we're talking about spec data. This is what I'm really excited about. So if you don't know spec, spec is an industry standard set of tests that aren't necessarily designed to be real world, but they do tell engineers about the core performance better than real world tests. There are two versions of spec. There are spec 2006 and spec 2017. And both benchmarks essentially have two halves, integer and floating point. So integer is basically anything that doesn't require fractional numbers. So that may just be math on whole numbers, or it can be control flow. Say when you're trying to move windows about in a plane, you don't need fractional numbers for that. Or pixel numbers, or just managing a database doesn't use fractional numbers, for example. Floating point is typically the math-heavy side. So they split it, those two. 2017 was meant to supersede 2006. However, a lot of, especially embedded companies that we speak to, still use 2006 as their main metric for evaluating new chips. And because we have because there's a backlog of 2006 data, it's highly relevant. So if we look here on this graph, let me move myself back down. This is spec 2016. The following graphs will be a bit different as we go on, but I'll walk you through them. On the x-axis, we have integer workloads. On the y-axis, we have floating point. Now, various companies, I'll also add a caveat that Intel, AMD, ARM, Qualcomm, Ampere, all of them, they compete for the best results in these benchmarks when they're officially submitted to the standardized body that moderates it. They optimize the systems up the wazoo. I'm talking firmware level modifications, core modifications, software modifications, OS optimizations, compiler optimizations, to the point where you get a value which kind of doesn't really matter. I mean, if you ever want to follow some of the story on this, go search for spec lib quantum optimizations. It's insane. With what we've done here, we standardized on one compiler and one set of flags, at least for x86, that all the vendors agreed were fair in most circumstances to all involved. And the fact that there's sign-off on AMD, Intel, and ARM is pretty significant. So we're not using using TCC and Clang. And the point is here that we're very regular and honest and keeping the data going through. We're not hyper-optimizing. There are some people who say that this data doesn't matter because vendors will hyper-optimize. They're free to do that. That's not necessarily what we're discussing here. So again, Spec 2006. Red dots are AMD going from Zen Plus, Zen 2, Zen 3, Zen 4. Blue dots going from Broadwell, Skylake, KB Lake, Coffee Refresh, Comet, Rocket, and Alder Lake P. There are a couple of results. We'll have the Alder Lake E ones in there as well. And for each generation, we're taking the best consumer desktop CPU. Bear that in mind. So whatever the memory specification was, whatever the frequency specification was, whatever the power specification was, that's what we're taking here. And we're seeing that Zen 3 to Zen 4 is quite a considerable speed up. Rocket Lake to Zen 3 was in the lead, Alder Lake took the lead, and Zen 4 now has the lead. So now, this next slide is, I'm going to put a point on here that we don't have exact data for. Intel, at its latest Intel Tech Tour, said that 15% single-threaded improvement performance. When asked, he said Spec into 2017. What I've done is I've taken that 15% and I've essentially applied it to Alder Lake P cores in both directions. This is Spec 2006 as well, so take it for what it is. It is an estimated rough point. And Raptor Lake performance cores form here. So they're actually slightly behind in integer if we take this data, and slightly ahead in floating point. That's 2006. Again, Raptor Lake isn't, that's a guesstimated result based on 15% improvement. Spec 2017, so newer version. I've also included some of the, the mobile chips in here. But you can see it's a bit more messy, especially in the mid. I mean, going from Broadwell to Comet wasn't necessary. We've had more improvements in core performance, Comet Lake to today, than we did from Broadwell to Comet Lake. Consider that. In percentages, they're probably roughly the same, but it's crazy to think that. And what we had is we had Rocket Lake and Zen 3 were about the same. And then Alder Lake P cores came up and went above. Zen 4 matches Alder Lake P in floating point, but goes way ahead in terms of integer performance. So, and then I'm going to do the same thing with Raptor Lake. And Raptor Lake comes back here. Again, this is no comment on power consumption. That's important to note. So, if you remember some of the A15 tests that Anantech did, specifically on the integer size, the A15, Rocket Lake, and Zen 3 are all very competitive with each other. Alder Lake P went above and beyond that, and Zen 4 will go another above and beyond that. The question is, where would you put the A16 on this graph? Numbers may be coming sooner than you think. So, and then, so here's Spec 2017 integer, but I've changed the graph a bit. So this is just the integer, not the floating point. And I've changed the x-axis to year of release, so we can get a sense of how these improvements have happened over time. So we go on the left-hand side, Broadwell to Skylake, to KB Lake, to Coffee Lake refresh, and you see Skylake to Coffee Lake refresh wasn't that much of a change, and it allowed AMD to essentially pop in Zen 2 and be the same as Coffee Lake refresh here. Comet went up, and then we had Apple's A14 come in, then Zen 3 came in, Rocket Lake pushed it, was a little bit behind in integer, then A15 came out, again slightly behind in integer. Around the same time, Alder Lake P came out, and then Zen 4 is up here. So the reason why I've partitioned this out into dates is because Intel specifically says that Raptor Lake is plus 15% integer Spec 2017, which means I can put this on the graph. Pretty damn close. Zen 4 versus Raptor Lake, regardless of power, single core performance is going to be really, really competitive. So, and then let's look at rate. So everything we've seen on Spec is just single core. There's a version of Spec also called rate where you run the same workload over all the cores, and you get a number that comes out based on frequency, cores, and it also taxes more of the memory system. So this will, because of the fact that we have 16 core parts, is going to be obviously AMD is going to be way up the top just because they have 16 full high performance cores, and Intel's got 8 plus 8. But as you can see, Alder Lake did pretty well against Zen 3 in this test. It's going to be interesting to see how much the additional 8 E cores in Raptor Lake will go anywhere near this. I do have the data on this for 142 watts and 65 watts, and again, it's still very competitive. The gen on gen is surprising, especially at the 65 watt level. So take that for what it is. I'm not gonna put the Raptor Lake numbers here because they were just talking about single threaded. And so that is kind of it. So the reason, if you didn't say from the start, the reason why I'm doing this stream is I'm currently in San Francisco. I spent 16 hours on a plane yesterday on my birthday. And rather than record something last night, I had 4,000 words of a script written, and that is less than half written. I decided, let's have a nap and let's just do a stream. And as you can see, it's now bright outside. I'm in town for Intel Innovation, which is happening Tuesday, Wednesday. Also Tesla's AI Day, which is happening Friday, so stay tuned for those. I still do plan to do a proper AMD Ryzen 7000 Zen 4 review video with basically all the numbers that you've seen, but a bit more insight perhaps into the instruction differences, and going to have a bit more of a structured discussion about those. So yeah, let me know if you want to see those. I also want to do a second video with a reduced power. That being said, the next few days are pretty intense, and I've got meetings to go to today in a few hours. So I should, now that that's everything that I'm probably going to say about this review, about this launch. So let's go into some Q&A. Thanks to Danvera for the super chat. Sorry, I did see it and it went scroll by so fast. So if people have any questions, now's the time. Let's do some Q&A. But in the chat at TechTechPotato, just so I definitely see it, because I'm ready to actually go have a shower now. Should have showered when I got in from the plane last night, but I just went straight to bed. Just get some breakfast. It's now 7:50 Pacific, or in my head. Cetek Astronomy asks any Pluton information. I did ask. No. That's a simple answer to that. And we have, If you want to know about AMD's Pluton implementation, watch my video about hot chips where I start screaming at the guy for not answering any questions. So, Rob B. Cactive asks, will he fall asleep at the Intel launch? Hopefully not. It is Innovation, which is essentially meant to be the Intel Developer Forum rehash. So it's going to be more focused on software, though I fully hope that there's going to be some hardware stuff. Andre, the CCD IOD bus width in the graphic didn't change from 16 to 30 bytes a cycle. Why did AMC say that happened? Isn't that sick? You make a good point. I don't know. I mean, they went on a long-winded explanation on this when I had a discussion with them, and they were very adamant, saying, "Look, with half the number of connections but double the frequency." So maybe they are double pumping. Maybe it's per CPU cycle rather than per Infinity Fabric cycle. I don't know. Opus 11 says, "Do you think Microsoft have to update the CPU schedule to optimize for power usage?" No, it's all part of it's already in there with CPPC and what have you. So you may see some Microsoft updates. I don't think there'll be anything major. Wembo Z asks, "How does the 58X 103D hold up against 7700X?" I didn't test 7700X. AMD have told me that it is shipping to my house, and given how much flights I'm going to be on for the rest of the year, you might see that you may see that review sometime around Christmas. I'm told that not everybody got the same CPUs I did, so go watch some other reviews. That's all I can say. Linnaeus asks thoughts on Raptor Lake versus Zen 4 3D. It's the 3DB cache is an easy way to gain performance in cache limited workloads, though adding E-cores is just a multi-threaded play. So, yeah. Evergreen asks, "How do you feel about thermal before power limit? Do you feel like this will cause premature aging of the substrate?" I mean, these chips are spec'd to 3 years as normal. I mean, maybe they won't be doing the full 10 years that we're used to, and may only be 7. My main thing, though, is more about the socket. So, this heat spreader has 8 eggs. I call it the octo spreader. Only 2 of them are held down. At some point, I've got a video. I think I've got a video scripted maybe about how I think AM5 might be limiting AMD long term, and that's part of it. So yeah, we'll see. Bigger and Better Things asks, "Will better cooling help a lot with overclocking even slightly?" Yes, though you may be fighting more cooling on the power delivery side as well, not just the CPU. Bear that in mind. I expect there'll be some overclocking data coming out today. I haven't done any yet. Was Machine Man asks, "Zen 4 per core boost test when?" That was already shown, wasn't it? So, Gogo Lander asks, "Missing the lockdown Zoom meeting yet?" Well, I was always an advocate for in-person meetings, purely on the basis that they always provided more insights than Zoom, because on a Zoom meeting, if you had Q&A, the Q&A would be limited. There'd always be a moderator who butchered your cues and didn't understand what you were asking. And in my case, I always ask long-winded questions because I always want a very specific answer, and they always get mangled. So I'm always one for in-person. Now, Q4, everybody's doing in-person events now, so I'm flying everywhere. And it just so happens that my flight to Philadelphia yesterday on the first leg, I sat next to a guy who was downing cold and flu medicine every 5 minutes and coughing and sneezing. So, but I still wear masks on planes because that's the sort of person I am. So hopefully it won't be too bad. Joto asks about Spec using AVX 512. No, our Spec is optimized to AVX 2. That was just a standard decision. That means we can use the same binaries from Broadwell all the way up to today. That's really what that is. I haven't seen Linus's take. I started streaming when the embargo went live. I'll probably watch. I'll probably watch it later though. I don't know. I wasn't too keen on Linus's ECC video. I think he was making mountains out of molehills. I think that was quite a bad take, to be honest. Though that being said, it would be a script written by somebody that was approved by Linus. So I think it's more going to end up being the writer's take than his. Will you ask Mike Clark if Zen 4 was tuned to run your program to get the 6X? I don't even know if he knows my code was given to him. I mean, he runs a team of over a few thousand people, over 1,000 at least. So John says breakfast at the pork store. So I'm actually in San Jose right now. I've never actually been around San Jose. I'm usually more in Santa Clara, so I have no idea what's around here. Uro asks, what's the consequences of 4 sticks of RAM versus 2? Did you test that? So Intel did say that even though memory support is 5200, with 1 DIMM per channel, when you go to 2 DIMMs per channel, it's either 3600 or 40. I think it's 3600. So DDR5 3600. We're going to get to a point where we only have 1 module per channel in the future anyway, but that will be 2026. Yeah, one of my biggest drawbacks, I reckon, of DDR5 right now is especially consumer platforms, is just capacity support. I need a system with 128 gigs of memory. So, how does the 12900K with the AVX512 loophole compare to 7950X? I didn't bring up the data, but if you go back to my AnandTech review, I believe I showed that data. So you may just have to pick the numbers. It's the same test. VOI asks 7000 series or 13th gen. I'm going to wait for 13th gen to come out. Arthur J asks, any comments on mid-range versus the high-end flipping on performance-price ratio? The 5800X 3D still seems strong against non-7900X for lower prices. You can either look at it purely as price performance, or you can look at it as longevity of a platform. If you get the 5800X 3D today, even though it's lower cost, even though you can use a DDR platform, even though DDR4, you're essentially at the end of that platform. I would say, yeah, at this point, if you've got enough, I would go, yeah. I would go down to Ryzen. I get the Ryzen 5. It's saying my stream is poor. No, it seems fine. How does performance scale with power? Did you try limiting 65 watt eco mode? Chris Cole. Yes, I have. That'll be in a future video. I haven't gone through all the data points, though general terms, at 65 watts, package power tracking, so not TDP, package power tracking, you have the same single-thread performance and about 2/3 of the multi-threaded performance. Any of the multi-threaded data that you saw, multiply it by 0.66, and that's roughly what you get when you limit it to 65 watts. But, yeah. Do you think AMD will kill the AM5 prematurely like they did the TR40 socket? Now, I'm going to annoy a lot of people because I think sockets should change regularly, more regularly, for 2 main reasons. 1, again, provides a better baseline for support. 2, during the time when AMD wasn't producing anything worth selling, or wasn't producing anything, if Intel didn't do a new generation every two cycles, then we would have seen a lot more motherboard manufacturers leave the market. And I'm honest with that. Yeah, so Iron Lion says, looks like you're hitting the weights a bit. Keep it up. No, I'm just stocky build. If anything, I need to lose some. Chris says Roman delidded and got 20 degrees better results. Sweet. The only problem with delidding is, or all these decoupling caps on the top. You don't want to shear those off in a hurry. So, Gert talked to. So I used a DH15, and those notch your fans don't spin up that high. So yeah, it's again testing on an open air test bench is. Let's see. So, Ultra Veridical says an Antec writes something about 2-cycle AVX512 implementation. I heard it's wrong. What's true here? So, when AMD had Zen and Zen Plus, when it implemented AVX2 workloads, it would take, which is 256-bit, it would take the 256-bit operations, split it into multiple 128-bit operations, and then do it that way. So you're essentially doubling the operations. AMD is doing the same thing here with AVX512. It's splitting it into 256-bit operations and doing it that way. So it's at a minimum 2-cycle. It may be more. AMD on stage called this double pumped, and as I said earlier in the stream, I don't like that phrase because that is the phrase that used to be used when Intel was running its execution ports at double frequency. So double pumped meant double frequency. And if you actually go back to the LTT video where Anthony is talking about Ryzen at the Zen 4 announcement, he was talking about double pumped, and they actually showed double frequency up on the video, and that's wrong. So, yeah. For those concerned about power usage in temps, how well does the CPU undervolt? Can the CPU turn into an efficiency monster? Yes, Spoon, it does. It does. In my low power testing, again, this will be another video. If you limit just the package power tracking to 65 watts, it's still massively performant. So that's what I recommend. That's probably what I'm going to do if I use this as my daily in the end. Radiating Redstone says in the POV-Ray power frequency core scaling test, did you use affinity masks to pin the threads manually? Yes. Did you count for CPPC preferred cores? No. That's an interesting point. I'm going to have to recycle that. I know exactly how I would test that. Yeah, I'm going to have to do that. Okay. Good point. Thanks, Radiating Redstone. Unfortunately, I'm not home for another week, so I won't be able to do that, yeah. But yeah, no. Yeah, I need to write that down. Test ST POV-Ray on each core individual. I mean, and that also gives us a chance to showcase a graph of what the peak frequency, on each core was. It's interesting. Any plan for an 8-core AMD versus 8 P-core only analysis? Probably not at this time. My schedule is just way too busy. There'll be a lot of other people doing that. Johto asks, how did you like presenting to a live stream over making a video? I fully expect that this live stream will get fewer traffic than a proper video. I also want to do an article for my Substack newsletter. That's my Substack newsletter is more-moore.com. More-more.com, with the second more having 2 O's. So there'll be a written version there, hopefully, when I get some time to do anything. Denver asks, with AMD saying OC can hit as high as 115, do you think we'll see standard temperatures hitting above 100? No, standard temperatures are limited to 95. Only if you're going to be pushing it and actually unlock those limits will it do that. So, yeah, it's... when do you think chipsets will have PCIe Gen 5 support? maybe next gen or the gen after. It's only one or two. So, Stefan, he's asking more about the chipset. PCI 5 lanes off the chipset and off the CPU. So, let's see. Any more questions? If you want me to answer a question at TechTechPotato, but I think that's all of them. So, I may be spending one day this week with PC World because their studio's just north. So if you want to hear Gordon and me talk about stuff, then shout out some ideas. Thanks, Rob. It was more. I'm glad AMD provided a lot of slides, just because everything that was coming through my mind was being prompted by the slides. So, how will the 7950X do versus current Gen Xeons in workloads? I haven't tested a mid-range isolating Xeon, so not recently. I don't think I've got any data for an isolating Xeon. I'm gonna have to see. But there's also an issue of Windows doesn't like scaling beyond 64 cores, so there is that. Martin, it is more heat. The issue is more about damage to the processor. So yeah, thanks, Joto. Appreciate it. Iron Lion, I have a document saved in the cloud, which is basically chapter ideas for a book. Though, depending on any given day, it'll either be highly critical or more explanatory. Darrell, it was yesterday when I was flying in the air writing scripts. So, Gert, so Digital Foundry gets a lot of support from the vendors, as far as I understand. So, and it's a very hard game to scale across testing against multiple systems just because of licensing and money, and everybody does it a bit differently. So, yeah. So, Tiago asks, no news on APUs, right? Yeah. Nothing on APUs. We're unlikely to hear anything about APUs until CES at the earliest. Denvera, I meant, do you think about 100 degrees C in future generations? No. Yeah, TJ Maxx used to be 65, now it's 95. It shouldn't go above 95. So it shouldn't really go above 95. And maybe, would you do a comparison between Replicove and Golden Cove and Zen 4, considering that Replicove is just full cache config for Golden Cove? I mean, yeah, when I get Replicove, when I get 13th gen in, I'll have a look. So, Neos asks, any update on Threadripper non-pros? It's still dead. As far as I know, it's still dead. When I asked about Threadripper, because they showed that slide of Zen 4 and it said Threadripper, not Threadripper Pro, I said, is this a statement about support for Threadripper non-pro versus Threadripper Pro? And they said, no, it's just a logo. They will come out with the right product for the right market at the right time that they think is more effective for business. So, yeah. So, and yes, this is the Zephyrus. It's I think somehow the system is. I used to have my more than more company name on it, and I think it's been lost. So I've been having a number of issues with it recently, pretty much all because I put a PCIe 4 SSD in it. Joto asks, would you be interested in benchmarking HPC interconnects if given the hardware? It depends. It depends, A, on what tests I'd run, because you can't just do a straightforward iPerf and be happy with that. So, yeah. I'm going to be meeting Patrick Kennedy today. We actually missed each other in the airport by like 10 minutes when we landed. Otherwise, we would have Ubered over because we're literally at hotels across the street from each other. I'll see him today. Maybe we'll sort out a live stream with him at some point as well. So, Mode asks, do you miss writing for AT during this hectic review season? No, I'm quite happy where I am now. Thank you. And no, I haven't heard about the new C64 OS. Every time I ping that Twitter account, they ignore me. So, yeah, it is what it is. Mark asks, will there be a Zen 4C based CPU on AM5? Probably not. Yeah. When video about silicon interposers. What do you want to know about silicon interposers? You can talk for hours about silicon interposers. Matt Powers asks, is Zen 4's high temperatures target going to be an issue later for Epic and data centers? So Matt, if you go to Server the Home, watch Patrick Kennedy's video, because I actually did record a small thing, 2 or 3 minutes for him. And basically, when you limit the N16 core down to 65 watts, you get very good performance. So if you multiply that out by 4 to 280 watts, should be good, should be fun. So nobody. So when I limited it 65 watts, or essentially Dragon range, it was about 25 watts idle, and that just may be a desktop thing. So realistically, only 40 watts were going into the cores. So yeah. And oh, there's my morning alarm, just in case. You have so much burn in my video, do I? Oh, yeah, camera focus. That's what I get for Panasonic. Is the temp configurable to a lower thermal limit? I briefly looked in the BIOS and in Ryzen Master. I couldn't see it, but I haven't used Ryzen Master for a while, so bear that in mind. Bear that in mind. It's you might have to find. Yeah, might have to find somebody else who's actually configure with that. I mean, you only get so much time to play with this stuff. I mean, I did no gaming tests, for example, just because people would complain that I'm using an old GPU. That and they break more often than not, and I haven't actually run my GPU gaming suite in almost a year at this point. Yeah, bigger and better things. We started when it was night. The fact that the sun's come up is what it is. So my view on ARM Neoverse. I haven't gone over ARM's latest announcement yet because they screwed up the briefing twice, and I was busy with other client work. So Neos, even though I said the idle is 25 watts, 21 to 25. I didn't necessarily go and break that down into sort of like a low power mode and what was IODI and what was anything else. So, yeah. It's so Arthur Red Star, are you AMD or Intel? So as you may not know, I am an analyst now, not so much press. So what an analyst does is works with the companies to either help them with direction, with messaging, identifying issues, internal, external. So the point about being an analyst is everybody pays you, and therefore you're not a shill to any one of them. So both AMD and Intel are clients of mine. We had a discussion the other day about one of the biggest Intel shills out there was saying, how much would you pay for a Patreon of my stuff? Most people selected 0. I responded in the Discord, yeah, you shill to Intel and get nothing. I give Intel AMD kicks up the backside for what they do, and they pay me for it. So it's, yeah. I've worked with both companies for a decade. I know all the people in PR and comms up and down. I know a lot of the engineers. I've helped craft official legal messaging for companies. I've been used as references for some of the engineers internally, who are going for promotions and need to provide external references, and they ask me to do that, and so. Yeah. No tech. So the initial plan was to do this in a proper video, but I just haven't had time to record. So that's why this is a stream. I still plan on doing videos. Unfortunately, my timing over the next week is terrible. So yeah. Do you run any benchmarks that give an idea for the MPI HPC performance? No, I don't. That's partly because I don't have any experience with MPI. When I started going multi-processor, it was OpenMP. So yeah. And thoughts about Intel financing via institutional funds for manufacturing recently. I mean, I was part of the Oxford Chemistry Department where they did a very similar thing for the organic chemistry building. It was funded by externally, but as a result, now the people who funded it have technically own 50% of all the patents that come out of that building for the next 30 years. It's a trade-off. It's all about leveraging risk. So, radiating redstone, rather strange read and write results for IDA 64, higher read-write bandwidth than is possible. I didn't see any issues. I can't remember if the BIOS update improved it a little or not, but yeah. All right, we've been going for a while. I'm going to have to call it quits because I've got meetings later today, and I might nap another couple of hours, and I've got a script to write. And the answer, Red Star, is thousands, hundreds of thousands of NDAs. You basically kind of know what you can say and what you can't. Yeah, so yeah, I'm going to call it there. Thank you all for staying. Sorry about the cut in. That was just this laptop disintegrating and then running out of battery. I'm going to need to charge my batteries. So, Peter, LN2, no, and yes, I do need some food. So at 8:20 a.m. on the West Coast Pacific. Good morning, and I'll see you in the next videos that drop. I've got some good ones.